On January 9th, 1853, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, uttered a remark to the British ambassador to St. Petersburg, his name was Seymour Hamilton, that the Ottoman Empire was sick. It was very sick. In addition, Nicholas floated by a very, very cynical deal of partitioning the Ottoman Empire. Russia would take over control of the Straits. That would be the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, the crucial lifeline that would link Russian ports on the Black Sea with the Mediterranean and the wider world market. And it was from those ports that most Russian exports entered the world market. In return, Britain could have Egypt, which was all important, on the route to India, and he would throw in Crete for laughs, give the British a couple of islands in the Aegean. The deal was communicated back to London. The Foreign Secretary, John Russell, immediately coined the phrase, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, presented that along with the cynical Russian deal to Lord Aberdeen and his coalition government. And the objective was Russell was to excite that government eventually into into an alliance with France and eventually to oppose Russian ambitions in the Ottoman Empire. The exchange in St. Petersburg was one of the causes for the outbreak of the Crimean War. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the two reform periods of Tanzimat were ended in effect by two great wars against Russia. The first is the Crimean War, waged between 1853 and 1856, and the second is usually known as the Russo-Ottoman or the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878. The first one ended in the Treaty of Paris, which was concluded on March 30th, 1856. And that treaty essentially represented a success for the Ottoman Empire and a personal triumph for Mustafa Rashid Pasha, the architect of Tanzimat. The second treaty ended in a peace dictated by Russia, the so-called Treaty of San Stefano, that was dictated on March 24th, 1878, and that treaty represented an absolute defeat for the Ottoman state. In the First War, the Ottomans had the alliance of the French, the British, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, and a benevolent neutrality from Austria. In the Second War, the Ottomans fought the Russians alone. And the question is, how did we get to this situation where the whole effort of reforms had been to strengthen the Ottoman state, to win alliances with Britain and the liberal powers of Western Europe, and the ultimate result was another major defeat at the hands of the Russians at the Treaty of San Stefano in 1878. The success of the Ottoman state in the Crimean War rested upon the important principle advanced by the reformers, especially by Mustafa Rashid and his protege, Fuat Pasha, that alliance with Britain, an informal alliance whereby the Ottomans could turn to the power of the Royal Navy to check the ambitions of Russia, was the cornerstone to diplomacy. That also influenced a great deal of the reforms that were conducted to transform the Ottoman state internally. As I mentioned, the appeals to liberal ideals that would sit well with the British public and the British Parliament and the ruling Prime Minister were included in many of the reforms as a way of showing that the Ottoman state was worthy of being supported, that the Ottoman state was, after all, part of the concert of Europe. And this was symbolized in all sorts of diplomatic arrangements, and perhaps best symbolized in the moves of the Sultan himself, Sultan Abdülmecid I, who's often sort of underrated on this, but really was quite an important man. He is the one who closed down Topkapi, ended the harem and the old tradition of ruling from the walled city, and built the essentially Baroque palace known as Dolmabahce Palace, which is farther up the Bosporus, and removed himself there, put on the dress and uniforms of a European constitutional monarch, took a single wife, and worked in tandem with Mustafa Rashid to promote this image that the Ottoman state was, after all, a modern nation, and one that was worthy of an alliance with Britain. That British alliance was premised on the fact that Britain was the world rival to the Russians. This is well known to scholars of diplomacy who deal with the so-called Great Game, the Russian and British shadow wars in places like Tibet, in India, best captured in the pages of Kim and The Man Who Would Be King and all of that British imperial literature written by Kipling. Mustafa Rashid appreciated the importance of the Mediterranean to the British, that is, the lifeline that would go through Egypt to India, and that informal alliance would allow the Ottomans to get the power of the Royal Navy, which the Ottoman state itself could by no means build. I mean, the Ottomans could not build a navy to match either the Russians or the British, but that Royal Navy would keep the Russians bottled up in the Black Sea and defend the Straits. That was an absolutely important premise, and it's extremely well expressed in the 1869 testament of Fuad Rashid, Fuad Pasha, who before his death wrote out the principles of Ottoman diplomacy for the benefit of the new Sultan, Abdul Aziz, who came to the throne in 1861. And it emphasized, the testament emphasized the importance of the British alliance and frankly said that if I were the Tsar of Russia, I would take Constantinople and the Straits as well. So never forget that principle. And these were very hard lessons learned in the Napoleonic Wars and in the clash with Muhammad Ali of Egypt, especially in that second war, where it was essentially the Royal Navy that bailed out the Ottoman state and got them a favorable treaty in 1841. They essentially lost control of Egypt, but they regained the Levant, and they countered the Russian influence in the Straits. Well, those principles were all important, and Mustafa Rashid worked very hard to maintain that informal alliance. And the British themselves were receptive to it. But one thing that Mustafa Rashid understood, the British interest in the Ottoman Empire was always conditional. It was to protect their interest. They did not want a formal alliance. They wanted access to Ottoman markets, hence the constant negotiation and renegotiating of trade agreements to lower tariffs, to open up the Ottoman markets to free market economy in which the British could excel in selling manufactured goods. And the British themselves were never really interested in supporting the Ottoman state in and of itself. They were pleased when liberal reforms were conducted, but it was a distant relationship, and Mustafa Rashid understood that. Now, that arrangement that was built up over the course of the 1840s and early 1850s paid dividends when a peculiar crisis erupted in 1851. And it's really a rather crazy situation, and it's brought about by Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the real Napoleon, Napoleon I. He's known as Napoleon III, or in the words of the French novelist Victor Hugo, as Napoleon le Petit, but that's another subject for another course. Louis Napoleon, he's not yet emperor, was the president of the Second Republic of France, and he raised an issue to court the Catholic conservative vote in France that France should protect the holy places. That is Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the Ottoman province of Palestine. And he cited, if you can believe this, all sorts of chapters going back to the capitulations of 1740 and even ultimately to the first one of 1536, which had been negotiated by Jean de la Forêt, that France had a responsibility to make sure that the various patriarchates of the Eastern churches were properly supervised and that Catholics controlled the pilgrimage routes and the holy places. Well, as soon as this was put before the Ottoman state, and it was very, very perplexing, both to the Sultan as well as Mustafa Rashid, why are they making a point of this? The Russians responded in return. The Tsar, Nicholas I, and his very, very ambitious foreign minister, Karl Nesserode, they raised the issue, well, wait, look, we are the protectors of the Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, and they cited provisions going back to the Treaty of Kachuk-Kai-Narcha, that treaty that ended the First War between the Ottomans and Catherine the Great, and they brought out the Treaty of Jassy and all sorts of provisions going back to 1829, and they insisted that they had the right to not only control the holy places, since they were, after all, the Orthodox czars of the New Rome, or the Third Rome, they should also essentially take over the supervising and running of the entire Christian population of the Ottoman state. Now, this was absurd. No state could agree to this. In effect, the Ottomans were to hand over something like 40% of their subjects to the direct control of the Tsar. And the demands were excessive, and it ended up in this bidding war between the French and the Russians over who had the greater rights. And of course, what was done is the Ottomans carefully temporized and dodged the issue. They set up commissions. And in the meantime, on December 2nd, 1852, Louis Napoleon pulled his greatest stunt, the plebiscite, that turned him from president into emperor, Napoleon III, and he became all the more insistent that as the emperor of the French, that he defend the Catholic interests in the Holy Land. And the situation just deteriorated between St. Petersburg and Paris, and Constantinople tried to dodge the issue. They set in commissions. They tended to lean to the Orthodox position. The French got angry, and Louis Napoleon, now Napoleon III, sent in the French battleship Charlemagne to defend the Ottomans from the Russians. The Russians sent their own ships. Of course, the Sultan and Mustafa Rashid were really kind of perplexed at their so-called defenders, the French emperor and the Tsar of Russia. And in the meantime, to placate the French, Mustafa Rashid was dismissed. And he had not lost his influence, however, and he particularly had very, very powerful influence with the resident British ambassador, a fellow by the name of Canning, Stratford Canning, who in some ways was called the Little Sultan. He had been in Istanbul for almost 30 years, and he was a major figure in the diplomatic scene. And what he did is try to push that British government into an alliance with the French in order to counter the Russian influence. And it was an amazing set of diplomatic stunts that allowed him to do this. In part, the Russians overplayed their hand. They assumed the Austrians would sit on the sideline. They made impossible demands. In March of 1853, they sent in their most, really a sledgehammer diplomat, Alexander Menshikov, who made all sorts of ultimatums, eventually left in anger in May. And in July of 1853, the Russians went to their usual diplomatic stunt of invading the Romanian principalities, with the next step of crossing the Danube and opening a war in the Caucasus. At that point, the Ottomans had very little choice. There was a French fleet in the Dardanelles that was offering protection, but what was really needed was the British alliance. And on October 4th, 1853, the Ottoman state declared war, and Mustafa Rashid cautioned the council that the only way this was going to work is if we had the British alliance. The Russians went even further. On November 30th, 1853, they sunk the Ottoman fleet in Sinop on the Black Sea. They had explosive shells, whereas the poor Ottoman fleet only had smoothbores. The French Navy alone could not help them. And the result was the English became alarmed. And in part because of that absurd statement made by Tsar Nicholas to the ambassador in St. Petersburg, and John Russell, in tandem with Mustafa Rashid, pushed the Aberdeen government into allying with France, countering the Russians. There was a series of negotiations that failed. And then on March 28th, 1854, France and England declared war on Russia, and the Crimean War was on. Now, the Crimean War is remembered in British circles for Florence Nightingale, the charge of the Light Brigade, and cardigan sweaters and all of that. But what was important from the viewpoint of the Ottoman Empire is the French and the British did all the naval fighting, as well as a fair amount of the fighting in the Crimea. The war was never intended to overthrow the Tsarist state. It was to check and take Russia down a couple of pegs. And it succeeded. On September 9th, 1855, the port of Sevastopol surrendered, and as a result, the Tsar had no choice, the new Tsar, actually, Alexander II, to negotiate the Treaty of Paris that was concluded on March 30th, 1856. Now, that treaty really marked a major triumph for the Ottoman state. First, the Russians had already evacuated Wallachia and Moldavia back in 1853. The war had essentially been fought only in the Crimea, and it reinstated the Ottoman suzerainty over Wallachia, Moldavia, and Serbia and Montenegro in the Balkans. Furthermore, it demilitarized the Black Sea. The Russians were not to launch any kind of fleets on the Black Sea. Now, this was an amazing provision, and it assured the British that no more Russian ships in the Mediterranean. That was never a possibility. The straits were open to legitimate Russian commerce, and any changes in the provisions of that demilitarization would have to be done by an international conference. The Russians would later ignore that in 1871 and simply start building ships again. But that came later on. Above all, the integrity of the Ottoman state was upheld. All of this nonsense that blew up over the holy places, which were really issues that were Trojan horses, where either the French or the Russians could intervene and manipulate the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire to justify other interventions, that was stopped. The Ottoman Empire's borders were recognized. And the Ottoman state was now actually admitted as a member of the Concert of Europe. It had a diplomatic position within the wider powers of the European community. This was a major triumph for Mustafa Rashid Pasha, and really represented the pinnacle of his diplomatic career. After the treaty, he was recalled as Grand Vizier. His son was actually promoted to important positions. There was the issuing in February of 1856, just before the treaty, of a second wave of reforms, a set of reforms that moved eventually to the summoning of a parliament in 1876. And so the Crimean War was a triumph of Tanzimat, a triumph of these reform movements, and it propelled a second reform period. Well, how did that success end up in such abject defeat in 1878? And that is a remarkable story in and of itself. In part, the differences between the crisis that blew up in 1875 as opposed to the crisis in 1851 through 1853 was a matter of personalities. Mustafa Rashid was no longer around. The men of the second generation of Tanzimat lacked his qualities as diplomats. But there were other changes that were really outside the control of the Ottoman ruling classes. First and foremost was the changing position of the British. Between 1856 and 1877, between the two wars, the British geopolitical situation changed significantly in the Mediterranean world. For one, the Russian menace started to recede. The British gained essentially the control over Egypt. They would eventually occupy it in 1882 formally, but what was most important was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. With control of the Suez, easy access was maintained between Westminster and Simla, that is the government in British India. Furthermore, you had telegraph lines and cable lines laid down where the British government could now monitor India directly through communiques. You didn't have to wait weeks for sending orders to the Governor General in India. And the trade of the British Empire depended on the control of the Suez and a friendly government in Egypt. And Constantinople was no longer that important. Second, Constantinople was a difficult sell for the British public. Now, in 1877, at the outbreak of the war, the prime minister was Benjamin Disraeli, who actually admired the Ottoman Empire in many ways. And he was probably seconded by a number of members of the British Army, especially officers who had served in the Crimean War. And the British had sort of mixed opinions. They thought that the officer corps of the Ottoman state was below standard, but they were very impressed by the fighting qualities of the Muslim soldiers in the Ottoman army. And many of them had experience with sepoys, especially North Indian Punjabis, who were excellent soldiers under British command in India. And there was in British military circles a great respect to the Ottomans as an imperial people, a people who had interest and a tradition of warfare comparable to the British. But that was a minority. By 1877, the liberal press and the liberal electorate in Great Britain demanded a much more liberal Ottoman Empire if they were going to support it and expend blood and treasure in defending it. And the Ottoman Empire, for all of its efforts, did not meet standard, particularly with William Gladstone and the liberals. And so the political opinion in Britain had shifted significantly. The geopolitical situation had shifted significantly. And the Ottoman state was really left without a British alliance. France was not a serious alternative. And Germany was just on the horizon. So it's understandable how they got so easily isolated in 1877. Part of it was outside of their control. Finally, there were internal problems within the Ottoman state that aggravated its ability to confront the Russian menace. First and foremost was fiscal. Now, the long-term consequences of floating a central bank, building a central bank, and floating all of these loans with European companies and investors, especially French and British, meant that the Ottoman state increasingly came into hock to British investors in Western Europe. And this is a situation that persists in modern Turkey and its successor states in the Middle East down to this day. Modernization and infrastructure projects were usually built by foreign capital, and that capital largely came from Europe. In 1875, the Ottoman state defaulted. It's an absolute crisis. It resulted in eventually setting up a public debt administration in 1881, in which the revenues of the Ottoman state were collected, and part of it was set aside for paying back the investors on the defaulted loans. And by the outbreak of the First World War, it was getting close to 30% of the state revenues paying off that default and that debt. Now, no state can function very well under those circumstances, and that hamstrung the later reforms. The Sultan himself, in 1861, Abdul Aziz, is an interesting character. He's the younger brother of the previous Sultan, and he was an absolute libertine, and he did a good deal of his part in running up the public debt by his extravagant expenses and all sorts of toys. He clashed bitterly with the reformed Grand Vizier, Mehmet Pasha, over finances, dismissed him in 1872, and he ended up getting deposed, finally, on May 31st, 1876, because of, quote unquote, his incompetence, and days later, on June 4th, was found dead, supposedly of suicide. So the leadership in the Ottoman state had its problems. And in 1876, within 3 months, there were three sultans. Once Abdul Aziz was deposed, his nephew, Murat V was put on the throne. He was about 36 years of age, and he had some responsible training, but he went into a fit of depression, particularly over his uncle's so-called suicide. There was lots of suspicions that the suicide was really a murder orchestrated by Midbat Pasha or his supporters, the reformers, and eventually they had to retire Murat V and go to his younger brother, then the 33-year-old Abdul Hamid II, who agreed to become the Sultan and was crowned, or he girt on the sword of Osman, he wasn't crowned, and became the third Sultan in 1876. Well, in this situation, it's pretty difficult to formulate an effective foreign policy. By the time he got to the throne, that is Abdul Hamid, the damage had already been done. In 1875, revolts broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Ironically, one of the unintended consequences of the Tanzimat reforms was the spreading of literacy and printing presses, particularly among the minority populations, Slavic speakers, Greeks, Armenians, and that resulted in the burgeoning of Slavic nationalism among the South Slavs, overwhelmingly Orthodox, who began to clamor for their own nation states and were encouraged, above all, by Moscow, by St. Petersburg, the Russian Tsar. And in 1875, the various Christian Orthodox in Bosnia and Herzegovina rose in rebellion, started massacring the Muslims, and immediately the Ottoman government swung into action. The Russians protested. Serbia and Montenegro, that were technically vassal principalities, within a year declared war on the Ottoman state. They were in turn attacked. There were revolts in Bulgaria, orchestrated by Bulgarian nationalists in Bucharest, paid by Russian money, who came over the border to free the Orthodox Bulgarians. That resulted in reprisals and massacres. By 1876, when Abdul Hamid was on the throne, his army was completely overtaxed. He was broke. And To put down these rebellions in the Balkans, he used various irregular soldiers. The modern term would be counterinsurgency irregulars. This was largely tribal groups, particularly Circassians and Tatars, who had been kicked out of their ancestral home by the Russians, resettled in the Balkans or in the Caucasus region, and they had great fun in torching Christian villages as payback. This led to a series of atrocities which complicated the situation in Britain. Because once these atrocities got to Britain, that Christians are being killed by Muslim Turks, the result was a storm of protest in the British press. And above all, Gladstone stepped forward and wrote a monograph called The Bulgarian Horrors and the State of the Eastern Question. And that just pushed the whole British public against the Ottomans. Gladstone is calling, it is time to kick the Ottomans out of Europe and take back Constantinople. Disraeli was beside himself. He saw the strategic implications of a Russian victory. And so the result was the Ottomans found themselves isolated from the British, facing a Russian threat, which was issuing ultimatums on behalf of these rebels in the Balkans. And it's understandable that Abdul Hamid II was enraged at what was happening in his empire. He was not being treated at all as a member of the Concert of Europe. And what was really insulting were two events at the end of 1876 that drove home to the Sultan that the reform movement had not worked. It had not given the protection it had promised. First is, as the Russian demands increased, and the fear was that Russia would win an overwhelming victory, the other great powers called a conference in Constantinople on December 12, 1876. And when the delegates arrived to discuss the fate of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans weren't even invited. The Europeans simply had a nice pleasure time in Constantinople to decide the fate of the Ottoman state, and Abdul Hamid II and his Grand Vizier, Midhat Pasha, were not there at all. Meantime, the reformist had convinced the Sultan, one of the conditions for him to come to the throne, to issue a new constitution. And it was on December 23rd, 1876, the Ottomans announced a constitution, they held elections, and early in the next year, the first Ottoman parliament convened. Well, most of the European powers simply treated it with derision. Gladstone wrote that such a constitution was a contradiction in terms. And the entire thing was dismissed. The Ottoman constitution in Parliament for the time was really a rather remarkable document. It was based on the Belgian Constitution of 1831. It called for a bicameral legislature. There was a complicated process for the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies, modeled after the French and Belgian parliament, that would be elected by the property classes. These electors would in turn elect the delegates. And by the standards of the late 19th century, it was a remarkably forward-looking document. It co-opted many of the local elites, particularly the Arab speakers. It did lead to a number of protests. Greeks in Crete, for instance, the Christians and Druze in the Lebanon protested the way the election had been set up and the whole election process. But nonetheless, the body of representatives that did appear more or less reflected the overall population of the Ottoman state. Even so, this greatest liberal effort to date to put together a parliament that represented Christians, Jews, and Muslims was essentially ignored by the Western powers, which had their own negotiations in Constantinople that had very little influence on the Russians. And the Russians made their own demands. And finally, the Russians in March of 1877 declared war on the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans had no choice but to face Russian aggression alone. Well, the result of the war was pretty predictable. Even though the Ottoman army was far superior than it ever had been, it was no match for the Russians. The Russians opened up fronts in both the Balkans and in the Caucasus, and it led to major Russian advances in both areas. The principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia that had been loosely united in 1858 now declared themselves independent as a Romanian kingdom under their king Alexander I. The Serbians rallied, the various Slavic populations gave assistance, And what was not publicized in the British press and the French press were the Christian reprisals against the Muslims in the Balkans. They committed their own fair share of atrocities, and many Muslims were driven out of areas into Asia Minor, and this is the first major exodus by 1878. Some would estimate as many as 400,000 Muslim Europeans had been pushed out of their homes into Constantinople or Asia Minor. And this was the first time the Ottoman state had to really deal with a large number of Muslim refugees. It was a traumatic shock. And the Ottomans never forgot the War of 93. That is the Muslim year 1293, equivalent to 1877-78, when the war was fought. Furthermore, the Russian army penetrated within sight of Constantinople and then called a timeout at San Stefano, a suburb, today that's known as Yashilkoy, and dictated a treaty known as the Treaty of San Stefano on March 24th, 1878. It recognized the independence of Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, which got various territories. It allowed Austria, who had allowed the Russians a free hand in the Balkans, to occupy and administer, but not annex, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Very, very important South Slavic areas, including the strategic city of Sarajevo and the Muslim population there. It created a huge, giant Bulgaria. And above all, it ceded certain important cities in the Caucasus, Batumi, Kars, Ardahan, to Russia, and the Russians had a supervisory control over the 6 eastern provinces of Anatolia, where Armenians were resident, and the Russians could protect Armenian interest, and it looked as if it was the first step to creating a Armenian nation state under Russian tutelage. Furthermore, Bulgaria was given enormous borders in the Balkans. It looked like the Bulgarian state of the 10th century. Well, the treaty went too far. The Western powers were worried about the size of the Russian conquest, and it took Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, took it upon himself to act as an honest broker. And between June 13th and July 13th, 1878, at Berlin, a Congress was held and the revisions were redrawn. Bulgaria was cut down to size and divided into 2 principalities, Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia, which were still vassals of the Sultan. Some of the powers in Eastern Anatolia were cut back. The Straits were left securely under Ottoman control, but the British got Cyprus as the door prize. The concert and balance of Europe was maintained. Germany took nothing. Germany intervened to bail the Ottomans out. Abdul Hamid never forgot that. For the first time, the new German Empire that had proved itself on the battlefields of 1870-71 was the European power to turn to. It clearly had the most efficient army, and the Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, had worked in the interest of the Ottoman state. However, Bismarck, as I said earlier, had essentially benign contempt for the Ottoman state. For him, the whole thing was maintaining a balance of power and isolating the French and keeping the Russians under wraps. And that attitude would characterize the German-Ottoman relationship through the First World War. Finally, Sultan Abdul Hamid II also learned that reform didn't work. On February 4th, 1878, he dismissed Mithat Pasha, never forgave him for deposing his uncle, and on February 14th of the same year, 1878, he dissolved parliament. He was going to rule himself, and for the next 30 years, the parliament of the Ottoman Empire was in recess. And the Sultan realized that what the Ottoman state needed was resolute, determined, effective leadership, and he was going to give it.